December 19th, 1942, 0347 hours, southern Tunisia. Oberstfreiter Klaus Mannheim peered through the frost-rimmed optics of his Panzer IV, scanning the pre-dawn murk for the American column his reconnaissance team had spotted an hour before. When the silhouettes finally resolved in the weak moonlight, he actually laughed. Blechspielzug, he muttered into the intercom, 10 toys. The lead vehicle was an M3 Stuart, that squat little American cricket of a tank with its riveted hull and popgun cannon. Mannheim had seen intelligence photographs, read the dismissive assessments from the Eastern Front veterans. 37mm gun, paper-thin armor, a rolling coffin trying to play soldier. He watched 3 more Stuarts clanking into the wadi below, their engines whining like sewing machines, and keyed his radio with a grin. "Command, this is Panzer II-8. Contact confirmed. American Kinderpanzers in the valley. We will crush them before breakfast." Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed. Every week we uncover the stories the world forgot. What Oberstfreiter Mannheim didn't know, crouched in his turret with 40 tons of German steel beneath him, was that the M3 Stuart's designers had never intended to win a slugging match with a Panzer IV. They had built something else entirely, a mechanical predator optimized for a kind of warfare the Wehrmacht had never truly faced on open ground. Speed as armor, mobility as lethality, and an operational tempo so relentless that firepower became almost secondary. The Stuart wasn't designed to trade punches. It was designed to be gone before you could swing. The M3 Stuart rolled off assembly lines carrying specifications that looked anemic on paper but came alive in motion. The Wright Continental R975 radial engine, a 9-cylinder air-cooled beast borrowed from aviation lineage, pumped 250 horsepower into a hull that weighed just over 14 tons when combat loaded. That power-to-weight ratio translated to 36 miles per hour on roads and 26 cross-country, speeds that made every other tank in North Africa look like it was moving through molasses. The main gun, a 37mm M6, fired a 2-pound armor-piercing round at 2,500 feet per second with the sustained rate of 20 rounds per minute. Maximum effective range against armor: 300 yards if you wanted penetration, 800 if you were shooting at soft targets or trying to suppress. 5 Browning machine guns studded the hull, 1 coaxial .30 caliber beside the main gun, 1 bow-mounted .30 caliber for the assistant driver, 1 anti-aircraft .30 caliber on the turret roof, and in later variants a pair of fixed forward-firing .30 calibers in the sponsons. At full combat load, the Stuart carried 103 rounds of 37mm, 6,200 rounds of .30 caliber ammunition, and enough fuel for 70 miles of tactical maneuvering. The suspension was a vertical volute spring system, 5 road wheels per side, each independently sprung, that soaked up terrain like a cat landing on its feet. Inside, the crew of 4 worked in a space so cramped that the loader and gunner had to choreograph every movement, but the mechanical layout was brilliantly simple. Fewer breakdowns, faster field repairs, and a transmission that could shift gears under load without grinding itself to shrapnel. But the real secret, the thing that would rewrite armor doctrine in the desert and the Pacific and eventually the hedgerows of France, was what American tankers started calling the dance. The Stuart couldn't absorb punishment, so it learned not to be there when the punch landed. Early training at Fort Knox and Fort Benning had been a bloodbath of shattered crews and broken machines because officers trained in the trench warfare mindset of World War I kept trying to use light tanks as miniature battleships. Stuarts charged German anti-tank positions head-on. They dueled with Panzer IIIs at static range. They died in droves. Then a cadre of younger officers, many of them former cavalrymen who understood pursuit and harassment, began teaching a different gospel. "You're not a knight," Captain Ernest Harmon told a company of green lieutenants at Knox in the spring of 1942, his voice echoing across the motor pool. "You're a goddamn hornet. Sting, move, sting again. Make them turn the turret. Make them guess. The second they predict you, you're dead." The new doctrine became almost mathematical. Engage at oblique angles. Never sit still for more than 10 seconds. Use terrain to break line of sight. Force the enemy to rotate his heavy turret while you reposition. Hit flanks and rears. And above all, never fight fair. If a Panzer IV presented its frontal armor, you didn't shoot. You disappeared into a fold in the ground, circled, and came back from a direction he wasn't watching. The first time the doctrine worked the way it was supposed to, it saved a crew that had no business surviving the night. February 14th, 1943, Sidi Bouzid, Tunisia. Second Lieutenant James Everett and his crew, Gunner Corporal Raymond Kowalski, Loader Private First Class Anthony Rizzo, Driver Technician 5th Grade Bobby Hayes, were running a reconnaissance sweep on the southern edge of the American defensive line when 3 Panzer IVs materialized out of the morning haze. Everett Stuart, call sign Rebel 2, was caught in the open, 600 yards from the nearest cover. The lead Panzer fired. The 75mm round snapped past the turret, so close that Kowalski swore later he felt the displacement of air through the periscope. "Move!" Everett screamed, and Hayes slammed the Stuart into a hard left turn, the radial engine howling as the tracks clawed at the hardpan. The second Panzer fired. The shell impacted 10 feet behind them, throwing up a geyser of rock and dust. Everett was already reading the terrain, a shallow wadi 200 yards northeast, maybe 3 feet deep, barely enough to hide the hull. Wadi, 11 o'clock, go, go, go. Hayes didn't hesitate, goosing the throttle and sending the Stuart hurtling across broken ground at speed that made Rizzo slam into the turret wall. They dropped into the depression just as the 3rd Panzer's round cracked overhead. Now they were invisible, tucked below the sight line, and Everett's brain was running pure calculus. Driver, creep forward, 10 yards. Gunner, watch the left flank. They edged along the wadi, parallel to the German advance, but out of view. One of the Panzers, frustrated, began traversing its turret back and forth, hunting. That rotation took 8 seconds. The Wehrmacht's Panzer IV turret was electrically assisted but still slow by American standards, and Everett counted it in his head like a metronome. Now, he whispered. Hayes gunned the engine. The Stuart leapt out of the wadi in a spray of gravel, and Kowalski fired on instinct at a range of 200 yards, aiming for the Panzer's track assembly. The 37mm round punched through the thinner side armor above the drive sprocket, and the Panzer lurched to a halt, smoke pouring from the engine deck. Before the other 2 German tanks could react, Rebel 2 was already diving back into the wadi, racing along its length, putting 400 yards between them and the last position. Everett didn't try to kill the other Panzers. He'd already won. He'd made them cautious. He'd made them slow down. And in that hesitation, the rest of his platoon, for more Stuarts that had been flanking wide, came screaming in from the east and tore into the German column's rear with a storm of 37mm fire and machine gun tracers. By the time the Panzers realized they were being swarmed, 2 were burning and the 3rd was retreating with a damaged radio antenna and a crew that would report, incorrectly, that they'd been ambushed by at least a dozen American tanks. 3 months later, at El Getter, the Stuart stopped being the hunted and became the hunter. March 23, 1943. The 1st Armored Division's light tank battalions were tasked with screening the southern flank of the main Allied advance when a German counterattack, 2 companies of Panzer IIIs, and a platoon of Stu-G 3 assault guns tried to roll up the American line from a dried riverbed. The Stuarts, now operating in coordinated packs of 6 to 8 vehicles, hit them like a pack of wolves. They didn't engage frontally. They used their speed to split into 2 groups. One swung north to draw fire and attention, dashing in and out of cover, taunting the Germans with brief bursts of machine gun fire, and then vanishing behind berms and burned-out vehicles. The German tanks, enraged, gave chase, and drove straight into the kill zone the second group of Stuarts had quietly established on the high ground to the west. At ranges between 100 and 300 yards, firing into the thinner side and rear armor of the Panzers, the Stuarts unleashed coordinated fire. Kowalski, now a sergeant commanding his own Stuart, watched a Panzer III take 4 hits in 6 seconds, 2 rounds punching through the engine compartment, one shattering the turret ring, the last detonating an ammunition rack in a white-hot flare that blew the turret 10 feet into the air. "They're running," his loader shouted. And they were. 3 Panzers reversing in panic, 1 Stu-G 3 abandoned by its crew, smoke grenades popping in desperation as the Germans tried to obscure their retreat. An intercepted German radio transmission, recorded by Allied intelligence and declassified decades later, captured the moment. Fall back, fall back. We are swarmed by light tanks. They are everywhere. We cannot hold. The officer's voice broke into static. The Stuarts didn't pursue into the open. They'd learned that lesson too. They held the high ground, cycled their ammunition, and waited for the next wave. It never came. The upgrade that turned the Stuart from effective to terrifying arrived in late 1943 and carried the designation M3A3. The hull was redesigned with sloped frontal armor welded instead of riveted, eliminating the deadly spalling effect that had killed so many early crews when rounds struck the rivets and sent white-hot fragments ricocheting inside the crew compartment. The turret gained a bustle extension to store more ammunition and give the crew another 6 inches of working space, enough to mean the difference between a smooth reload and a fumbled shell under fire. The engine received upgraded oil coolers and air filters to handle the choking dust of North Africa and later the Pacific Islands. But the most lethal addition was external, a set of field-modified rocket rails that allowed some units to mount M8 4.5-inch rockets on the turret sides, giving the Stuart an instant-fire bunker-busting capability. Crews in the Pacific began calling it the Wasp because of the sound the rockets made on launch, a tearing, buzzing shriek that sent Japanese infantry diving for cover before the warheads even detonated. One Marine observer on Tarawa watched a Stuart fire 4 rockets in sequence at a reinforced Japanese pillbox, each warhead trailing a streamer of white smoke, and said later, "It looked like the tank was angry, like it was throwing punches." Then came the range problem, and the Americans solved it the way they solved everything, with logistics that bordered on the supernatural. The Stuart's 70-mile operational range was fine for short engagements, but as the Allied advance accelerated across North Africa and into Italy, tanks were outrunning their fuel trucks. Engineers welded external auxiliary fuel drums to the rear hulls, 2 30-gallon cylinders that could be jettisoned in combat, but effectively doubled the Stuart's reach. Convoy doctrine evolved. Dedicated tank recovery vehicles shadowed every armored column, carrying spare tracks, road wheels, and complete power-pack assemblies that could be swapped in the field in under 4 hours. Repair crews became magicians, cannibalizing wrecked Stuarts to keep others running, and the simplicity of the Continental radial engine meant that a competent mechanic could rebuild a carburetor or replace a cylinder head using tools that fit in a backpack. By mid-1944, American armored units were achieving operational availability rates above 90%, meaning 9 out of every 10 Stuarts assigned to a unit were combat-ready at any given time. German tankers, by contrast, were nursing Panzer IVs and Panthers with availability rates that hovered near 60%, constantly scavenging parts, waiting for rail shipments that never arrived, watching their strength reports dwindle from mechanical attrition alone. The Stuart's role shifted as the war ground forward. In North Africa and Sicily, it had been a reconnaissance screener and flank harasser. In Italy's mountains, it became a close support infantry tank, using its machine guns to suppress German positions in villages and ruins where heavier Shermans couldn't navigate the narrow streets. In the Pacific, against Japanese light tanks and fortified positions, the Stuart was practically a monster, its speed useless in the jungle mud, but its firepower overwhelming against Type 95 Hago tanks that weighed 7 tons and had armor measured in millimeters. At Saipan, a platoon of Stuarts from the 2nd Armored Battalion engaged a Duggan company of Japanese infantry and 4 Type 95s at dawn, and the battle was over in 11 minutes. The Japanese tanks, armed with 37mm guns of their own but lacking optics, training, or doctrine, fired wildly and hit nothing. The Stuarts, fighting hull down from prepared positions, methodically destroyed all 4 enemy tanks and raked the infantry trenches with interlocking machine gun fire until white flags, makeshift, desperate, began appearing on shattered rifle barrels. And then the Germans started writing about it. Captured diaries from Tunisia and Italy began showing up in Allied intelligence summaries, and the tone was unmistakable. They did not fight like tanks. They fought like cavalry from 100 years ago, fast, harassing, never stopping to trade blows. We could not predict them. Our guns could kill them easily, but we could not see them long enough to aim. Another entry, from the diary of a Wehrmacht lieutenant killed at casino, was more bitter. The Americans do not need good tanks. They have so many bad ones that it does not matter. Destroy 5, and 10 more arrive the next morning. Our replacements come in 1s and 2s. There's come in fleets. The industrial avalanche that Oberstreiter Mannheim and 10,000 men like him could never truly comprehend began in places like Detroit and Flint and Moline, in factories that had been stamping out Buicks and Cadillacs 18 months earlier and were now running 3 shifts around the clock to build tanks. By the end of 1942, American industry was producing M3 Stuarts at a rate of 500 per month, 17 tanks every single day, including Sundays. The Cadillac tank arsenal alone, a sprawling facility outside Detroit that hadn't existed in 1940, was turning out complete Stuarts at a pace that required a finished tank to roll off the line every 63 minutes. The production process was a symphony of violence and precision. Hull plates sheared from steel sheets by hydraulic presses that could bite through 2 inches of armor like paper, welded together by teams of women. Rosie the Riveters had already moved on to more complex work, who ran bead after bead with arc welders that turned the air blue with ozone and sparks. The Continental radial engines arrived by rail from the Wright plant in New Jersey, already bench-tested and ready to bolt into place. Tracks, road wheels, return rollers, drive sprockets. Every component flowed through the factory in a choreographed dance that would have impressed Henry Ford himself. One Wright Continental radial, fully assembled, contained 847 individual parts. One M3 Stuart contained 6,214. By 1943, the United States was not just building tanks, it was building them faster than the enemy could destroy them, faster than crews could be trained to operate them, faster than ports could ship them overseas. When a Stuart burned in Tunisia, its replacement was already crossing the Atlantic. When 10 Stuarts were knocked out at Salerno, 30 more were waiting in depots in North Africa. The Germans could kill American tanks. They could not kill the factories. And the factories were feeding a machine that had learned to think. By late 1943, American tank battalions were integrating lessons from 2 years of combat into a lethality matrix that German planners couldn't match. Stuarts now operated with direct radio links to forward observers, infantry companies, and even fighter-bomber squadrons. A Stuart commander spotting a German strongpoint could call an AP-47 strike in under 4 minutes. Tank infantry coordination drills, practiced endlessly in training stateside, meant that American rifle squads knew how to use Stuarts as mobile cover, how to mark targets with colored smoke, how to signal threats the tankers couldn't see. In the bocage of Normandy, those killer hedgerows that turned every field into a separate fortress, Stuarts became the eyes and ears of heavier Sherman battalions, nosing into gaps, probing German defenses, drawing fire to reveal anti-tank gun positions that the Shermans would then obliterate with 75mm high explosive. The Stuart's thin armor, once a liability, became almost an advantage in this role. It was fast enough to spot a threat and reverse out of danger before the German gun crew could reload, and expendable enough that commanders were willing to risk it in ways they'd never risk a Sherman. One Stuart crew in the 2nd Armored Division kept a running tally on their turret. Spotted 23 at guns, survived 23 times. They made it all the way to Germany before a Panzerfaust finally caught them outside Aachen, and even then the crew walked away. Then the Stuart met its final boss, and the myth that it was too light to matter died forever. The Panther tank, Germany's answer to the T-34, a 45-ton masterpiece of sloped armor and a 75mm gun that could penetrate a Sherman's frontal armor at 1,000 yards, was rolling off production lines by mid-1943, and Allied tankers quickly learned that a frontal engagement was suicide. The Panther's glassy plate, sloped at 55 degrees, was effectively impervious to the Stuart's 37mm gun at any range. But the Panther had weaknesses, and American crews were trained to exploit them with surgical precision. The side armor, especially above the tracks, was thinner, 40mm at vertical, and the engine deck was practically unarmored. More critically, the Panther's turret traverse was slow, powered by a manual system that required the gunner to physically crank the turret around if the electrical system failed, which it often did. American doctrine evolved. Stuarts operating in pairs or trios would bait the Panther into turning its turret toward one tank while the others flanked. Near Aracourt, in September 1944, a platoon of 4 Stuarts from the 4th Armored Division engaged 2 Panthers defending a crossroads. The lead Stuart, commanded by Lieutenant Michael Crespi, charged directly down the road toward the Panthers, firing his 37mm gun and machine guns in a continuous stream, not to penetrate, just to get attention. Both Panthers rotated toward him, their commanders assuming they were facing a suicide run. Crespi's driver, Corporal Eddie Vincente, slammed the Stuart into a hard left turn at the last second, disappearing behind a stone barn. The Panthers, committed to their traverse, were still tracking left when the other 3 Stuarts appeared from a sunken lane on the right, less than 200 yards away. They fired in sequence, aiming for the engine decks and turret rings. One Panther erupted in flames immediately, the engine compartment cooking off in a pillar of black smoke. The second Panther, attempting to back up and rotate simultaneously, threw a track and slewed sideways. The Stuarts closed to point-blank range and hammered it with every weapon they had until the crew bailed out, hands raised, faces blackened with smoke. Crespi reported the engagement in 5 words: 2 Panthers, no casualties, continuing advance. The operation that cemented the Stuarts' legacy came in the Vosges Mountains of eastern France, late November 1944, during the brutal advance toward the Rhine. Task Force Lovelady, a combined arms team built around a company of Stuarts and 2 companies of armored infantry, was tasked with clearing a series of fortified villages that the Germans were using to anchor their winter defense line. The weather was biblical: freezing rain that turned roads into skating rinks, fog that cut visibility to 50 yards, mud that swallowed vehicles to their hubs. Heavier tanks bogged down or slid off narrow mountain roads. The Stuarts kept moving. On November 21st, Lovelady's column encountered a reinforced German position outside the village of Moyen-Moutier. 2 companies of infantry, 3 Panthers, and at least a dozen machine gun nests in stone buildings. A frontal assault would have been a massacre. Instead, Lovelady split his Stuarts into 3 groups. One group demonstrated loudly from the south, firing into the village and drawing German attention. The second group looped west through a forest trail that intelligence said was impassable for armor. The Stuarts made it through by sheer mechanical stubbornness, tracks chewing through underbrush, crews dismounting to clear fallen trees with saws and charges. The third group found a logging road to the east and used it to climb to high ground overlooking the German rear. At 1,430 hours, all 3 groups attacked simultaneously. The Germans, hearing engines and gunfire from 3 directions at once, assumed they were surrounded by a much larger force. The Panthers tried to reposition but couldn't coordinate in the fog. One threw a track trying to reverse on icy cobblestones. Another was hid in the engine deck by a Stuart firing from an upper-story window. The crew had driven the tank into a partially collapsed barn and used the elevation to shoot down at a 30-degree angle. The German infantry, caught in overlapping machine gun fire from Stuarts that seemed to be everywhere, broke and ran. By nightfall, Moyen-Moutier was in American hands. Casualties: 12 wounded, none killed. 1 Stuart damaged by Panzerfaust, back in action within 24 hours. A German prisoner, a young lieutenant who'd commanded one of the infantry companies, was overheard telling another POW in the holding area. It wasn't even their big tanks. It was those little ones, those fast ones. They were ghosts. You'd shoot at one, and 2 more would appear behind you. How do you fight an army that can be in 3 places at once? The MP guarding them didn't speak German, but he understood the tone. Exhaustion, confusion, something close to awe. The numbers, by war's end, told a story that no propaganda could exaggerate. Between 1941 and 1945, American factories produced 13,859 cubic meters and M5 Stuart light tanks, the M5 being an improved variant with twin Cadillac engines and better crew ergonomics. That was more light tanks than Germany and Japan produced combined across all weight classes. American training programs graduated 145,000 tank crewmen during the war, cycling them through courses at Fort Knox and Fort Benning that lasted 12 weeks and included live-fire exercises, night driving, radio discipline, and combined arms tactics. German and Japanese training, by contrast, was increasingly abbreviated as the war ground on. 6 weeks by 1943, 4 by 1944, sometimes less. Veteran crews were irreplaceable. One Panzer ace might take a year to train, and when he died, that experience died with him. One American Stuart crew might be green, but they had a standardized training manual, a simplified operating doctrine, and a replacement tank waiting if there's burned. The Stuart's loss rate was high. Nearly 40% of all units saw combat losses, but the replacement rate was higher. A Stuart knocked out on Tuesday was replaced by Thursday. A crew killed on Monday had a new crew in the same tank, repaired by the following Monday. The Germans called it Materialschlacht, material battle, a grinding calculus where steel and production defeated skill and courage. They weren't entirely wrong. Stuarts participated in every major American campaign: North Africa, Sicily, Italy, Normandy, the breakout across France, the drive into Germany. They fought in the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge, screening flanks and hunting German reconnaissance teams in the frozen forests. They landed on Pacific Islands where the terrain was so hostile that even their speed couldn't save them, and still they ground forward, using flamethrowers and machine guns to burn Japanese defenders out of bunkers and caves. Total combat sorties logged by Stuart units exceeded 890,000 by conservative estimates. Confirmed kills, enemy vehicles destroyed, positions overrun, infantry casualties inflicted, were harder to tally because Stuarts often fought in swarms where individual credit was impossible to assign, but intelligence estimates placed the number above 4,200 enemy armored vehicles destroyed or disabled, plus incalculable damage to infantry formations, supply columns, and defensive strongpoints. The kill-to-loss ratio fluctuated wildly depending on theater and opponent, but in engagements where Stuarts were used according to doctrine, fast, flanking, coordinated, they often achieved ratios above 3-to-1, and in some Pacific battles against Japanese armor, ratios above 10-to-1. Against German heavy tanks in deliberate ambushes, the ratio inverted, but the Stuart's job was never to trade evenly. Its job was to be part of a system, and the system was unbeatable. By April 1945, as American columns crossed the Rhine and drove into the heart of Germany, captured Wehrmacht documents revealed a frank assessment of Allied armor tactics that buried any lingering delusions of Aryan superiority. A German intelligence report, dated March 12, 1945, and recovered from a bombed-out headquarters near Frankfurt, analyzed American light tank employment with clinical precision. The enemy's M3/M5 series vehicles are individually inferior in armor and firepower to our medium and heavy tanks. However, their operational employment negates this disadvantage. American light tanks operate in concert with infantry, artillery, air support, and heavier armor in a manner that our forces can no longer counter. Their speed allows rapid exploitation of breakthroughs. Their numbers allow saturation of defensive sectors. Their mechanical reliability allows sustained operations that exhaust our defenders. Most critically, their crews are trained to a uniform standard and appear willing to accept losses in pursuit of objectives, knowing that replacement vehicles and personnel will arrive within days. This is not tank warfare as we understand it. This is industrialized warfare, and we have no response. The officer who wrote that assessment was killed 3 weeks later when his staff car was strafed by a P-47. His report was filed, forgotten, and rediscovered by American historians in the 1960s. It remains one of the most honest appraisals of American armored doctrine ever written by an enemy. Today, in the dim coolness of the American Heritage Museum in Hudson, Massachusetts, an M3A1 Stuart sits behind velvet ropes on a polished floor, its hull painted in the olive drab and white star of the North African campaign. The 37mm gun is elevated slightly, as if still scanning for targets across a desert that exists now only in photographs and fading memories. Schoolchildren press their faces to the glass, marveling at how small it is, how cramped the crew compartment must have been, how thin the armor looks in person. The placard beside it lists specifications and campaigns. The Stuart didn't win the war alone. No single weapon ever does. But it taught the world a lesson that echoes through every armored vehicle, every military drone, every weapon system that followed. Supremacy is built not on elegance or individual lethality, but on the ability to be everywhere, all the time, until the enemy has nowhere left to run. If you love untold stories from history's darkest hours, subscribe and join us on the next mission through time.